Work on that word. All right, Shedeur Sanders. I know, I'm getting shamed now. Shedeur Sanders had a breakout performance yesterday against the Titans, throwing for over 350 yards, 3 touchdowns, while running in another. His play put the Browns in position to tie the game late in the fourth quarter with the 2-point conversion. But in a shocking move, head coach Kevin Stefanski took Shedeur out of the game for the attempt.
There are bad sports takes. There are takes that age poorly over time, and then there are takes that fall apart so quickly that the person delivering them barely has time to finish their segment before the evidence starts proving them wrong. That is exactly what just happened with the narrative surrounding Shedeur Sanders and the Cleveland Browns.
Cam Newton, what did you make of Kevin Stefanski's decision to keep Shedeur on the sideline for that 2-point conversion?
Extremely embarrassing. And it's a fireable offense, if you ask me. When you start to think and unpack what's been happening week after week after week.
An NFL analyst recently went on air suggesting that the Browns might already be preparing to move on from Sanders. The idea sounded dramatic enough to spark debate instantly. If true, it would mean Cleveland had already lost faith in one of the most talked about young quarterbacks in the league before he even had a real opportunity to establish himself. But here's the problem. Within hours of that claim spreading across sports media, information coming directly out of Cleveland began telling a completely different story. Local reporters covering the Browns every day started pointing to the same pattern. The organization's messaging, the way coaches were discussing the quarterback room, and even the front office's off-season planning all suggested something far different than a team preparing to move on. In fact, the signs pointed toward the opposite conclusion. Instead of distancing themselves from Shedeur Sanders, the Browns appeared to be quietly structuring their entire offseason around him. That kind of contradiction is where sports narratives get exposed the fastest, because when a claim collides with real insider reporting, roster decisions, and front office strategy, the truth tends to surface quickly. And in this case, the truth is starting to paint a picture that looks very different from the one the analyst described.
So this is something that we talked about a little bit yesterday on Browns Daily. I really don't think you can have another 3-person quarterback competition, let alone 4, like you did last year. So could you, to me, if you were to bring in another veteran, and I'm just going to throw out a name, not that I'm advocating for this, but just a name that was mentioned in one of those, from the Athletic yesterday of the quarterback room predictions, and they mentioned Justin Fields for the Browns. Now, to me, if you're bringing Justin Fields in, and obviously, Todd Monken's had a lot of success with Travis Schweitzer, there's a lot of things they could carry over from Lamar's playbook with Justin Fields.
But the most revealing part of the story isn't just that the narrative about Sanders leaving Cleveland looks shaky. It's why the narrative started collapsing so quickly once people looked at what the Browns were actually doing behind the scenes. Because the first clue that something didn't add up came from an unexpected place inside the Browns' own quarterback room. If you really want to understand what is happening with the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation, you cannot just listen to national debate shows. You have to listen to the people who are actually around the team every single day. And that is where the story starts shifting dramatically.
Let me say this to you. It was awful. First of all, let's get that out the way first. And I want to tell you that in Cleveland, I don't know if y'all know this, but they've got some of the best sports talk radio shows in America. Cleveland is an outstanding sports town.
Local Cleveland coverage over the last several days has consistently pointed toward a completely different interpretation of the Browns' off-season strategy. Instead of treating Shedeur Sanders like a temporary option or a player on the edge of the roster, insiders have described him as someone the organization is actively preparing to build around. That distinction matters more than people realize. NFL teams reveal their priorities in subtle ways. It is rarely one giant public announcement. Instead, the clues show up in the way coaches talk about players, the way executives approach roster construction, and the way media members who are close to the team start describing the situation. Right now, those clues keep pointing in the same direction.
I think that it's got to be, Deshaun and Shedeur Sanders are going to have a competition to be the starting quarterback. That's what Todd Monken has said. That's what I believe to be the case right now, and I think Deshaun Watson is very much in that competition. Now, if you were to bring in another quarterback that you really thought had a legitimate chance to start, then I would say that somebody's got to go. And that's the only thing that would make sense to me. I don't think you can have a 3-person quarterback competition. It's just not enough reps to get everybody ready. And I think that, hopefully that's one of the learnings we had last year is that you've got to get guys ready to go. And so to me, I hope this is a competition that, they have decided pretty early on. And so that when you go into training camp, or at least when you're only, let's call it a week or two into training camp, that you've got your answer. So that person can get every rep, everybody can get on the same page, and you can go from there.
Reporters covering the Browns have noted that Sanders continues to be discussed with a tone that sounds forward-looking rather than temporary. When analysts close to the team talk about Cleveland's off-season decisions, they consistently frame those moves around one central question: how does this help the quarterback situation moving forward? And more often than not, that quarterback they are referring to is Sanders. That does not mean the Browns have publicly announced him as the starter. NFL teams rarely move that quickly with young players, but it does suggest something important. It suggests that the idea of Cleveland preparing to move on from Sanders does not align with the signals coming from the people who are actually paying attention to the organization's day-to-day decisions. And once you start comparing those signals with the moves Cleveland is reportedly exploring this offseason, the gap between the analysts' claim and reality becomes even harder to ignore. Because the next clue in this story involves a quarterback who might not even be part of Cleveland's plans much longer. Sometimes the clearest way to understand a team's priorities is not by looking at the player they are promoting. It is by looking at the player they are quietly pushing into the background. In Cleveland's case, that player appears to be Dillon Gabriel. For months, Gabriel was part of the conversation surrounding the Cleveland Browns quarterback room. He had the college production, the experience, and the reputation of someone who could at least compete for opportunities at the professional level. But recently, something interesting started happening. His name almost disappeared from the conversation.
Well, the names that you hear that are available, A.J. Brown is one. Now, I will say this. I think what the Buffalo Bills did yesterday is going to make it a heck of a lot harder to trade for a wide receiver than it was before they did that. Now, maybe from kind of the talk around the league that everybody thought that was an incredibly rich compensation package that they gave up to get DJ Moore, a second-round pick for a guy who hasn't had 1,000 yards in 3 of his last 4 seasons, and is being paid a lot. And then they guaranteed some of his money into 2028. So if you are the Philadelphia Eagles with A.J. Brown, you're saying if that's what DJ Moore got, I'm going to need a lot more than that. So I think that could make this a lot harder. And then in the case of Marvin Harrison, has he produced at the level anybody expected? No, but he's still on a rookie contract for 2 years, potentially 3, if you look at, obviously the 5th-year option. Marvin Harrison Jr. was highly regarded coming out. It hasn't worked out. You'd have to dive into why that is, but I think that they're going to want even more compensation than a DJ Moore. This is in their mind. Obviously, you'd say, well, listen, it hasn't worked out here, but we know his talent, an ascending player. So I think that Bills trade and a little bit of the desperation they put in that might make it harder for some of these wide receiver deals to get done of the guys that you would think you could bring in that could fundamentally change your offense. So that's something certainly to keep an eye on. Again, like I said, if A.J. Brown was a Cleveland Brown tomorrow, I would be thrilled. And I think he's got a lot to prove in terms of he felt that he was underutilized. He was not happy with the quarterback play that he was receiving while he was there. That is pretty well known. And I think that he would want to, show, hey, I'm still that elite guy. And so I would be thrilled with that. And then on the other side, I think Marvin Harrison, if you could somehow, and who knows if this is even within the realm of realism, but if you could trade, let's say 39 for Marvin Harrison Jr., and then you could go offensive line, or move around and still get 2 offensive linemen in that first round, I think that would be an unbelievable setup for the Cleveland Browns.
Multiple observers covering the Browns noticed the same pattern. During press conferences and discussions about the quarterback situation, Gabriel's presence in the room was barely acknowledged. When reporters asked about the future of the offense, the responses focused on other players and other possibilities. That kind of silence can speak louder than criticism. In the NFL, teams rarely go out of their way to publicly dismiss players. Instead, they simply stop talking about them. They shift the conversation elsewhere. They let the narrative move forward without directly addressing the player who is slowly fading out of the picture. And that appears to be exactly what is happening here. If Cleveland were truly preparing to move on from Shedeur Sanders, you would expect Gabriel to become a much larger part of the conversation. The organization would highlight his development, discuss his potential role, and build excitement around the possibility of him stepping into a bigger opportunity. But that is not what has happened. Instead, the quarterback discussion continues to revolve around Sanders and one other familiar name inside the Browns organization, which leads to the next major piece of the story. Because once you remove Gabriel from the equation, the Cleveland quarterback competition suddenly looks much simpler than it once appeared. When people talk about the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation, they often describe it as a crowded room. But when you take a closer look, the competition may not actually be that complicated. If Dillon Gabriel is drifting toward the edge of the roster conversation, then the Browns quarterback battle becomes much clearer. It comes down to two names, Shedeur Sanders and Deshaun Watson. That framing changes the entire discussion.
Shedeur is 6'2", historically accurate, and I have seen him standing around normal-sized people. He's big. He's a big 6'2". Mahomes is 6'1.5". Aaron Rodgers, you never think about his size. He's 6'1", big calves, big wrists. 6'3", Matt Stafford. 6'4", Jared Goff. 6'6", Joe Flacco. Eli was 6'5". Peyton was 6'5.5" or whatever he was. Dillon Gabriel is noticeably smaller and thinner than Bo Nix. And Bo Nix is not ideal size in the NFL. He is a very, very small guy. Shedeur Sanders.
Watson is the veteran with the contract, the experience, and the complicated history with the franchise. For years, the Browns invested enormous resources into building around him, hoping he would eventually deliver the kind of stability the team has been chasing at quarterback for decades. But football situations evolve quickly. Performance, injuries, coaching changes, and locker room dynamics all shape how teams evaluate their future. And sometimes those evaluations lead organizations to reconsider who the real answer might be. That is where Shedeur Sanders enters the picture. Unlike many young quarterbacks entering the league, Sanders arrived with enormous expectations already surrounding him. His college career generated headlines, his leadership style attracted attention, and his confidence made it clear that he was not stepping into the NFL just to sit quietly in the background. That kind of presence naturally creates pressure inside a quarterback room, because once a team starts imagining what a young player could become, the conversation shifts. Reps become more important, development becomes more focused. Every glimpse of potential carries more weight than it did before. And when that process begins, the competition between a veteran and a rising player can resolve itself much faster than people expect. That possibility is exactly why the next phase of Cleveland's offseason is about to become so important. Because if Cleveland are truly preparing to give Sanders a real chance to lead the offense, the moves they make around him in the coming months will reveal everything about where the franchise believes its future is headed. One of the biggest clues about Cleveland's real plans is not coming from the quarterback room at all. It's coming from the wide receiver market. Reports from around the league suggest that the Browns have been exploring major receiver moves, including interest in elite targets that could immediately transform the offense. Names like A.J. Brown and Marvin Harrison Jr. have surfaced in discussions, and those are not minor upgrades. Those are franchise-level weapons. That matters because NFL teams do not pursue receivers like that unless they believe their quarterback situation is worth investing in. Wide receivers of that caliber expect to play with a quarterback who can deliver the football consistently and lead an offense capable of competing. If Cleveland were preparing to move on from Sanders, chasing a receiver like A.J. Brown would make very little sense. Instead, these conversations suggest something much more deliberate. They suggest the Browns are looking at their offense and asking one central question: what kind of weapons does our quarterback need to succeed? And more often than not, the quarterback connected to that question appears to be Shedeur Sanders. Once all these pieces are placed together, the analyst's claim about Sanders leaving Cleveland becomes harder and harder to defend. The insider reporting does not support it, the team's messaging does not support it, and the roster moves Cleveland appears to be exploring certainly do not support it. Instead, the evidence keeps pointing in the opposite direction. The Browns appear to be simplifying their quarterback situation rather than adding more uncertainty. Dillon Gabriel's fading presence suggests the team may already be clearing space for a more focused competition. At the same time, Cleveland's front office is reportedly exploring ways to strengthen the offense around the quarterback position. Those moves don't look like a team preparing to move on. They look like a team preparing to move forward. Because once you examine what the Browns are actually doing behind the scenes, the narrative about Shedeur Sanders leaving Cleveland begins to fall apart. Now the real question has changed. It's no longer about whether Sanders belongs in Cleveland. It's about how quickly the organization will fully commit to him. Every NFL team eventually reaches that moment with a young quarterback. If the Browns truly believe in Sanders, the next step becomes clear. Build around him and let the offense grow with him.